All right, welcome everyone to Sunday School. Today we are going to continue on in the Pentateuch from Genesis into Exodus. And as we read it, one of the things that you will notice is that it feels seamless. So in our scriptures, it's a different book. We go from Genesis to Exodus, but it's not going to feel like, oh, we're reading a different author, we're reading a different style. It will feel like the story just continues on. We really don't feel our first abrupt shift until we get to Deuteronomy, where all of a sudden we go from a narration in the third person about the Israelites and Moses to what turns into a first person discourse by Moses, which we can talk about another time. But so it really doesn't feel that different. It feels like the story is just kind of continuing on. Why don't we pull it up right away and we can start to read. Now remember, one of the things I want us to do is pay attention to history of interpretation. And what I'm going to try to do is not go overboard, on that as we read the text, but as we get to the point where we start watching some movies for homework, we'll start filling them in. But I will mention at points the lack of detail that we would expect to find. And I won't kind of go into where that all comes from. We'll get to that later. As a Bible teacher, one of the things I always do, and lit teachers often do the same thing, there's the pop reading quizzes that you give students just to say, I need you to be reading. So, there's always a chance that there could be a quiz, so just read every day. And I would often joke with my colleagues that there's no better book to catch the fakers in than in the book of Exodus. Because a lot of Bible stories, right, you remember and you know from childhood, but so much of the book of Exodus and the story of Moses in the Exodus, we know through movies. We know through the things that we've watched and seen on television. And all of a sudden when you read the text, you're like, wow, it's really kind of bereft of a lot of those details. So again, we'll talk about that as we go, but we're going to cover a few chapters today and you're going to think, just wait, this is 3/4 of the way through the movie. So we'll always keep kind of running into that a little bit. So let's begin. Remember, we just had Joseph die and said he needed to be taken back to the land, but he's not taken back the same way Jacob, there was the whole procession, but we'll get to that later. So it begins with this. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The total number of people born to Jacob was 70. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died and all his brothers and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong so that the land was filled with them. Now again, just to show this literary connection in the books, from the very beginning in the creation story, right? We were commanded to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And then we get the promise about you will become this great nation with a great name. And here we get to the beginning and it says, look, it happened. They were fruitful, prolific, multiplied, grew strong, and they filled the land. All right, so that's like the transition from Genesis into Exodus. And that's the end of the happy times. It quickly transitions to the negative. And we'll talk a little bit about this first verse 8, but let me read the section first. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless, imposing tasks on the Israelites, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. All right, let me pause here. Now, this becomes what we typically see in societies where people fear an internal threat, right? You begin to marginalize and oppress to keep them from taking over power. When I read this passage, I always think of that scene in Fantasia with Mickey Mouse and the brooms, right? The more you keep thinking you're stopping them, they just keep increasing and taking over the land. Now, let me say a couple things. And as we go through this book, we'll bring up some historical aspects. But one of the things to just be upfront about is that we really do not have much, or some would say any, reference to the Israelites or the Hebrews in Egypt. So this becomes a big debate among historians, archaeologists, biblical scholars. Where are the Israelites, right? If we have all these people in ancient Egypt and they're in overwhelming numbers, you would think there would be texts about it. You think there'd be notes about it. You think there'd be inscriptions or mention of Moses or any of these kinds of things. Well, there's not. There's no, I shouldn't say no. There's a scholar, some scholars who will argue for a couple different hieroglyphs in a certain text, and they say this must or might be referring to the Israelites, but they're small and obscure. To the level of which the book of Exodus portrays that these Israelites are being a problem and a threat and a fear, there's nothing making any reference to any of this. There's no reference to the Exodus. There's no reference to the plagues. There's no reference to the death of the firstborn. All these things that you would think, well, this would be a big deal, and so someone would talk about it. Some people make the assumption from that, well, therefore, the biblical story is way overblown. It didn't quite happen this big. You had small bands of people leaving, but later the narrative was pulled together in this great epic story as part of an Israelite foundation story. Others, though, point out that the way Egyptian historiography works, the way Egyptians tell the story of their pharaohs and the dealings of life in Egypt, is that they had this worldview that everything works on a regularity, on a certain kind of cycle, that every year the Nile floods, it fertilizes the land, they harvest, they grow crops, they harvest, and things are stable. Every year they tell about how they fight wars with all their surrounding neighbors and how they always win. And the way the Egyptians saw the world working is that the gods controlled the universe and it ran on clockwork. And for that reason, in areas where we do know that there were historic battles and issues that did not go well for the Egyptians, they tend not to tell any of that in their history. Because to tell those kinds of stories says the universe is not flowing in its right rhythm the way the gods control it. So the other side of this academic argument that says, okay, it doesn't mention any of this stuff about the Israelites. Well, of course not, because that's not the kind of stuff that Egyptians would ever mention. They're never going to mention the stories where they look bad or where things don't go as they should. So again, we don't need to get into all the details of those arguments, but you have scholars on both sides trying to come up with an explanation of why you have no mention of any of this stuff. But in this passage we just read, I would agree with the scholars that say we do get a certain historical hint in verse 8. Verse 8, where it says, now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, let me pull up something for us to look at. And for those who don't like history, I won't bore you with lots of details, but I want you to just see something here. Historians divide the history of Egypt into three major kingdoms: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And under those periods, all the nomes, these small, like we would call them like state-like territories, are all unified, and the country functions as a whole united monarchy. In the Old Kingdom is when Egypt was at its greatest power. And that's when things like the pyramids were built. All that great stuff that we always see, and you see the incorrect paintings of Israelites building pyramids. That was probably like 2,000 years before the Israelites ever got there. So they never, no historian would ever say that the Israelites had anything to do with the pyramids. Pyramids were Old Kingdom. Between each of those kingdoms, though, Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom, there are these periods that the historians call the intermediate period. And it kind of shows the historical frame of the scholars that say the normal periods, the right periods, are when everything works as a whole as a united monarchy. Not the time when things are fractured and they become more divided and sectarian, and the nomes functioning with greater strength and not in a unified whole. But it's the way much of human history tends to work. Like, think about Europe, right? Like you have these countries that come together in places like Yugoslavia, but then they fracture down into these smaller tribal groups like you have now, right? And then there will be these moments in history where, like European Union's an example, right? We're like, how do we all kind of function more as a working whole? I'm not a prophet, but I'd say if history bears out, there will come a time and Europe will break apart again and everyone become very much driven by their own nationalism and independence. You have the same thing in Egypt. These intermediate periods are periods where things break down from the normal overall monarchy. It's interesting, between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, this second intermediate period. And if you look at the top of these, and the date is like 7, right? See up here, 1725 BCE. This name right here, Hyksos.
I'm still seeing Exodus.
Oh, you are? Is everyone still
Yeah.
seeing Exodus?
Yeah.
Let me fix that.
Yeah.
Oh, I shifted in mine. I didn't shift the screen. Okay, now do you see it? How about now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. In the second intermediate period, so the Middle Kingdom would have been above, then the second intermediate period here begins in 1725 BCE. And you see this name right here, the Hyksos. The Hyksos, which was part of the 15th dynasty, the Hyksos were Semitic invaders who were coming from the area, which would have been like the Palestinian Levant, the area of Canaan. And these invaders come in and work their way down to eventually take over all of Egypt. Normally in Egyptian history and culture, again, they were not very open and friendly to outsiders, particularly to the Semitic people, because they were seen as kind of like, the farmers, the herders. They weren't the civilized people. But things change during the intermediate period when the Hyksos take over. And some have suggested that the Hyksos period would have been the time most likely for someone like a Joseph, a Semite, a person from Canaan, who could ascend in power and have such great authority. That's not something that makes sense under normal Egyptian history, But some have argued during the time of the Hyksos, they were Semitic peoples. They were more open to Semitic peoples. And so during this period of time, it would make sense for Joseph to come to power. But if you come down here to the 18th dynasty, 1550, this is the beginning of the new kingdom. And the new kingdom begins when they overthrow the Hyksos dynasties, and you have this new Egyptian strength and unification of the entire kingdom. And this is when we're going to get the Ahmose dynasties, and then we're going to get the Ramses dynasty. And some have said, let me pull up our text. Some have said when the new kingdom pharaohs take over, it would make very sense that that would be verse 8. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. People are like, look, Joseph's the number 2 power in the land. He saved the country. He built the stores. How could you not remember this guy? Some historians say that represents the end of the Hyksos dynasties, the beginning of the new kingdom, wiping everything clean. And they're like, well, yeah, we're not remembering this family or this guy. This is a new start, a unified, pure Egyptian Egypt again. Which again, it can't be proven, but I think it makes a lot of sense that this would be the shift that takes place about why no longer was the memory of Joseph and all the greatness continued on, and that his family that was honored at the end of Genesis now becomes slaves. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? All right, so here's where the oppression begins and it starts to go sideways. But what I love about it is our theme of tricksters is alive and well. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and allowed the boys to live? Okay, they're caught. These women, who we think are Egyptians, who are functioned as midwives to the Hebrews, do not follow the king's order to kill the boys. And he says, why did you do this? And they say something here, which is actually like a racist slur, but they use it for good. Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. This vigorous word is a word used for like goats and herds. Like it's like, hey, these ladies, they're not like Egyptian women, right? We just get there and they already popped them out. They're saying like, we had nothing to do with it. So God dealt with them, with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God and gave, because they feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live. Okay, so the original plan was to get the midwives to subtly kill the boy babies. Because again, what was their great fear? If there's an enemy, they're going to mount up strength. They're going to become part of the enemy armies. So the men were feared. So he said, let's get rid of the boys. Pharaoh made a very big mistake. If you want to conquer a people, don't worry about the men, worry about the women. He made that fatal flaw and it's going to bite him. So he says, all right, let's be more blatant about this. Baby boys get thrown in the river. All right. Now, story transitions. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. And notice, no names, just a man and a woman. And now pay attention to how this text is gendered after this. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that that he was a fine baby, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Okay, there was a father, but after that, every person who moves the narrative forward to protect the baby is female. All right? And if you go back further, it was the female midwives who were saving Hebrew boys. The beauty of this book and the establishment of Moses, this has become favorite material for feminist Hebrew Bible scholars because they're like, look, the women are the heroes. The women save the day. The women move the plot forward. And I think this is supposed to be, the irony of the Pharaoh's plan was let's subvert this people by taking care of the men. And in the end, it's the women who move the story forward. Couple things just to note. This basket with the bitumen and pitch, that's the same language that's used when Noah seals up the ark. All right, this is like a little mini ark that they put the baby in. And they place this baby in the river. Now, let me just point out one comparative story that is really interesting. If you go to Mesopotamia and the great king Sargon, there is a story of Sargon who gets put in a basket and sent down the river, who gets found by a priestess on the riverbank, and she raises him as her son, and he becomes the great king of the Assyrians who starts a new dynasty. And so there's been a lot written about this interesting thing about great men who become the heroes of their people, who were sent down a river in a basket. Now, in this story, it really doesn't say that he floats down the river. Now, Steven Spielberg does a good job of showing more of the Sargon story of the basket floating down the river and his sister giving chase. But here, it's just placed on the riverbank and they're watching. All right, any questions about that? All right, let's move the story forward. More women. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. Okay, let me just stop there for a second. Again, continuing on our trickster theme about tricksters winning and receiving blessing. One, the boy's life is saved. Two, the mother who would have wanted to keep her child and nurse it and raise it ends up still nursing him and raising him for his first years, and she gets a wage for doing so. And again, all these tricksters who move the story forward are women. And then this is something we miss. not understanding Hebrew grammar, but this is a funny thing here. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses, in Hebrew, Moshe, because she said, I drew him out of the water. Okay, this is actually like a funny grammar mistake. If you really wanted to name him drawn out, his name should have been Musha. She named him Moshe. Moshe is an active participle, not a passive one, and it means draws out. She named him the drawing out one, not the drawn out one. And for those of us who know this story, it's like, oh, dang it. She named him the wrong thing if you're an Egyptian, because he's not going to be the one who just was drawn out of the water. He's going to be the one who draws his people out of Egypt. All right. So, but again, how much good Hebrew could you expect the Pharaoh's daughter to know? She didn't pay attention in her Hebrew lesson, which again is like a weird, remember earlier, nobody in the king's court knew Hebrew. There needed to be a translator. So this naming him and giving a Hebrew name, some have said, if you look at a lot of Egyptian pharaoh names during this period, it has a Moses element to it. Amenosis. If you look at all the different kings, it will have Achmos. Our famous King Tutmosis, right, has a Moses element in its name. So some have said she's giving him an Egyptian name that is actually a Hebrew name, ironically, as well. All right, does that make sense? All right. Now look where the story goes from here. She draws him out of the water. The next thing we read is the following. One day, after Moses had grown up, all right, he's grown up now. He went out to his people and saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinfolk. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, he saw two Hebrews fighting. And he said to the one who was in the wrong, why do you strike your fellow Hebrew? He answered, who made you a ruler and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. Okay, so let me ask like 3 questions for you to process here. Let me go back up to the last paragraph we read. How is it that Pharaoh's daughter sees a child in a basket and says, oh, this is a Hebrew child? Next question. When it says in verse 11, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinfolk. How does he know it's his kinfolk? Let me pause here for a second. Because in your mind right now, you're wondering about, but when was he the prince of Egypt? How did his rivalry with his brother go? How did he, all these questions of every show and movie, we're going to see that all comes from somewhere else. He comes out of the water. The next thing you know, he kills the Egyptian. So question number 1, thoughts about how does he know his heritage?
Well, one thing I noticed in verse 10, it says, when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh. So how old is he? Is he 1, 5, 18?
Yeah. Typically,
That's a good point.
in the ancient world, you're probably nursing for a couple of years at least. So he's probably a toddler. So one could argue maybe he has some memory. He's 2, 3 years old, that he comes from somewhere else. Yep. Anybody remember in Anybody remember in Ten Commandments? It comes from the rabbinic stuff, but do you remember how they identify that he's a Hebrew?
Circumcised?
No. In fact, I think we're going to realize later he's not circumcised. An Egyptian circumcise as a ritual of becoming men, so it's a puberty act. In the Ten Commandments, they kind of go on this, one of the rabbinic commentaries, where she looks at the cloth he's wrapped in and she says, oh, this is Hebrew. This is like Hebrew cloth. Must be one of the Hebrews. The most obvious answer is probably knowing the rule about throwing the boys in the river. It's probably like, well, who else would be floating down the river? Which, again, I mean, there's a little humor to that too, right? This is a good trickster act of, did she break the law or did she follow the law? No, we put him in the river. Nobody said he couldn't be in a basket.
It doesn't really say in the Bible if they knew he was a Hebrew or Egyptian, but I'm just trying to think out loud, maybe go back to American days of slavery. But in this case, maybe it wasn't obvious that from appearance that a person was Egyptian or a person was Hebrew. They're all Semites, and so they're similar in appearance. So if the daughter of the Pharaoh raised him or had him raised as Egyptian, then in essence he became Egyptian, or you would say he passed. And that's probably what happened. But meanwhile, all the time this is going on, his mother didn't want to see him completely Egyptian. So she told him, keep this a secret or else you might be killed, but you're really Hebrew. And so in his mind, he was raised as one, but actually was another. And he's continued to have loyalty for the Hebrews, but on his day-to-day operation, he was Egyptian.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking out loud for something I know about.
And it's exactly right, because we will watch the interpreters, and which is what we're going to call our filmmakers, wrestle with that very point. And there will be particularly with Spielberg, these moments where you see the young man have these remembrances of like, oh, just wait, who am I? It becomes this part of like personal self-discovery, which again is good and modern, right? Like the way we deal with like identity and ethnicity and heritage. It'll be a little bit different in 10 Commandments, but similar in another way. So you're right, but like so much of the story that we love from the movies and the characterization of this story really doesn't come from the text. All that brotherly rivalry stuff, all that, like none of that is anywhere. One day he's a baby, the next he kills the guy. So that will be something we'll be looking for and watching for. But one of the things that I've read in some of the scholars who have really talked about this idea of the women are the ones who move the story forward. And again, in Judaism, women are the ones by which Judaism continues on. It doesn't matter if your father's a Jew. Fathers and grandfathers Jewish all the way back. It's your Jewish mother and grandmother who make you Jewish. And in some ways, this story gets pulled into that of it's the women who are passing on the heritage and the line and the tradition and the memory of who we are as people. So there's this very matriarchal aspect of this story.
Well, maybe it also had to do with the men and the boys appeared to be the real threat because they were bigger and stronger.
Right.
And so all the animosity went towards those folks. And even we could see this today. the animosity in America goes towards black males. And you might say maybe the black females get a free pass only to show up in Congress at unusual numbers.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. There is always the fear, right? If there's a people group one fears, the males are seen as the greatest threat.
Well, if you're walking down the street and you saw a black male, and on the other side of the street was a black female, well, any fool would go on the other side of the street, only to find out that she would actually sue him. So instead of beat him up. So, you know, what seems like a common sense sometimes is not. And it ended up burning the Egyptians. They didn't take the women seriously.
Yeah. And look where it gets them.
Yeah, they got what they deserved.
Right. All right. So Moses flees, and we're going to see something. We're going to see something common here that should trigger something now that you're all sophisticated Bible readers. Moses fled from Pharaoh. He settled in the land of Midian. So Midian will be to the wilderness out in the east, and sat down by a well. You should be going, uh-oh, here it comes. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. But some shepherds came and drove them away. Moses got up and came to their defense and watered their flock. When they returned to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come back so soon today?" They said, "An Egyptian helped us against the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he? Why did you leave the man? Invite him to break bread." Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah in marriage. Zipporah is a bird, so her name, she's Birdie. But again, he meets these girls at the well. The next thing you know, he's married off. The pattern holds. He bore a son, and he named him Gershom, for he said, "I have been an alien residing in a foreign land." Gershom means alien or foreigner. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. Okay, so let's talk about that last close. This is one of those interesting things where our theology and what we know and believe about God, that passage seems like an obvious truism. But remember the things in the book of Genesis where, you know, God hears the blood of Abel crying from the ground, and God going down to Sodom and Gomorrah to say he wanted to see if what he was hearing was true. And so he sends the messengers. This has that same feel. The heavier it gets, the Israelites start to cry out. And then it reads here, like all of a sudden God hears it, right? It said God heard their groaning and God remembered his covenant, which again has this feeling like, oh, he'd forgotten. And again, we know God does not forget, and we know God doesn't have to hear something. But as this narrative is told to us, it personifies God, this whole anthropomorphic representation, right? It makes him like a human being that would go like, oh, I hear somebody. Oh yeah, that's right. I have this covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's time to get to work, which kind of is how it sets up what's about to come next. It isn't that we look at it and go like, oh, God forgot all about them. But as it portrays God in the text at this point, it's in a way that it's like, oh, he just heard the word and I got to get on this. All right. Any questions? I just want to look at the very beginning of chapter 3. So,
Yeah, Dean, I've got a question.
Yeah.
So in Genesis, we talked about the Hebrew kind of generally meant was a broad brush for just a foreigner. So in Exodus, is Hebrew and Israelite now the same, or is Hebrew that's still broad brush?
Yeah, let me be really clear. The Hebrew seems to be related to a word which was a general broad brush for like the riffraff on the fringe.
Mm-hmm.
Hebrew refers to the Israelites, but it's referring to them in a way that seems to be more negative or outsider term. And it will in here because I think it's going to be intentional. We're going to see Moses in places refer to himself and his people as the Hebrews to the Pharaoh, where I think he's trying to downplay their threat. So that aspect of Hebrew, we're going to see still in that way. Yes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay. And then Zipporah, do we know of the 7 daughters, would she have probably been the oldest then?
Yeah, that's what we assume.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's look at just the beginning because chapter 3 and 4 in some ways are fundamental to the story and theology of the Bible. And so I want us to spend a bunch of time. I don't want to just fly through them real fast, but let's just look at the beginning of it. Because again, one of the most famous stories. But I want you to see some of it in new ways.
Burning bush.
Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. That's a new detail. He was Ruel a few minutes ago. Now he's referred to as Jethro, referred to as a priest. Okay, we can worry about all the details of what's going on there. But his father-in-law has 2 names, Ruel and Jethro. And when I would give those little pop quizzes, I think because of the Beverly Hillbillies, Jethro was always remembered more than Ruel. But anyway, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now, just to be clear, Horeb is the other name that sometimes we have for the mountain where God gives the covenant, Sinai. So Sinai and Horeb, like Jacob and Israel, are those kind of interchangeable namings. But here he comes to Horeb, which of course, right, you're familiar with in the state of Ohio. We just dropped the H, right? We have Mount Oreb. That's just that's, so maybe it was there, right? We already talked about Adams County and the Serpent Mount. It's a very biblical state. We have our Mount Oreb as well. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses, and he said, here I am. Then he said, come no closer, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. All right. I want to make one, and I've talked with you before. I don't know if this is one of those things that's stuck or if it'll feel new. But in my first semester of graduate school, I got to take the book of Exodus with Rabbi Hanan Brichto. May his name be remembered. It was in his class that I got the idea that became my dissertation topic. It was in his class that I was challenged to think about and read texts in ways that I'd never done before. And we were just beginning the third chapter, a very famous story that all of us knew and, had gone over many times. And we translate this passage. And he said one of the most profound things that challenged us all, that I realized so many powerful things are in the text that I'd never thought about, because we just read and understand what we've always understood. And here we sat, a bunch of PhD candidates and a couple of rabbinic students. And he said, why a burning bush? What's the point? And one of us said, well, the bush didn't burn up, so it was a miracle. And he said, obviously, but why a burning bush? And then you go, well, what do you mean, why a burning bush? Because bushes burn up. Well, yes, but why a burning bush? And we couldn't get past the fact that, well, because the bush should burn up and didn't. He said, well, why not a burning bicycle? Or why not a talking snake? Or why does God use a burning bush at this juncture to deliver this message? And we were like stumped, like no one ever asked us that question. And Hanan Brichto said, the power of this passage is that it is establishing Moses as God's prophet. And he said, if you think about scripture, over and over, the picture of fire is of God's all-consuming, purifying power, which you can't get too close to or it will destroy you. Moses hides his face. You can't look at God and even live. You cannot, we find out later, go into the Holy of Holies. You cannot encounter this deity without being destroyed. He is so powerful and so holy. And Hanan Brichto said, the burning bush is the perfect picture of the prophet, because the frail combustible bush should be destroyed when it encounters the fire. Just like a human being cannot contain the all-powerful, overwhelming, untouchable fire of the divine. But he said the miracle of the prophet, like the burning bush, is that one can contain the very power of God and speak as his representative and not be consumed. He said the burning bush becomes the power of the image of what every prophet is. And we will find later where God refers to Moses, said, you will be God to Pharaoh, and Aaron will be your prophet. This idea that he will take on the very persona of the deity so the prophet is not consumed. That is a powerful image. And for us, as believers and followers of Jesus, we are brought back to the picture of the day of Pentecost, where as the Spirit comes upon everyone, as people start to speak in languages, which shows the reversal of the Tower of Babel, where people were separated and divided, but now brought back together. Every person in the upper room had what looked like a flame, tongues of fire on their heads, to say the prophet was no longer the one person in a generation, the one person maybe in multiple generations who carries the power of God to be the spokesperson, to be the voice of the Lord. But every one of us in whom the Holy Spirit dwells becomes a prophet, becomes the very fire of God of which we should not be able to withstand, but because of the power of his work. We all are reflected in the burning bush. And there we all sat as a bunch of PhD students who thought we knew everything, with our mouths hanging open, like, just wait, this rabbi just gave us the most powerful picture we've ever heard of, not only the prophet, but the picture of who we are to be from the day of Pentecost forward. So with that,
Can I ask a question here?
yes,
I don't know what I'm missing, but I'm still not hearing the answer to the question, why a bush rather than a bicycle or something? I see a bush as something rooted in the
Right.
ground that did not burn, and that to me is interesting. But I'm still not seeing that question. What am I missing here?
it's the idea that the miracle of a thing that should burn up does not. So rather than just could have been a talking snake, or it could have been some other kind of a miracle. And he said, if you look at it in that part of the world where you get heat of like 120 degrees and you would see little things burning, and the grounds get scorched, and fire is always a problem. It's the idea of something that would normally easily be destroyed by the fire continues to withstand it and is not destroyed. So the voice coming out of a burning bush is paralleled with the voice coming out of a human being, that God could speak through us but not destroy us. So it wasn't that it had to be a bush, but it'd be something that
All right.
a landscape that could be destroyed very easily by a consuming fire.
Okay, so it's not the bushness, it is its
Right.
inflammability-ness.
It's
Okay.
vulnerability
Okay,
not
I got it.
destroyed by the fire.
Okay, I got it.
Yeah. Other comments or questions?
Has anybody done work looking at this bush and the tree of life back in Genesis?
That's a great question. I don't know that there
Yeah.
must be something somewhere. I mean, check
Horticulture
that.
theologians, okay. Mhm.
Yeah, I'll have to look for that. That's a good question. Other questions or comments? When we begin next week at this point, we will deal with like a really powerful passage of God's self-revelation in the giving of his name, which again is one of those really central passages of all of Scripture. But again, as you all think about this story, realize we're already to the burning bush and we're only 2 chapters and a few verses in. Much of Exodus is going to be beyond the Red Sea. Red Sea only gets us to chapter 14. And then from there on, it's about Sinai, law, and the creation of the tabernacle.
One more question.
Yes.
The Pharaoh's daughter seems to have kind of dropped out of the narrative here. Did she not care that this person that she reared as her son took off, and no longer is there a female driving the narrative, as we made a point of earlier? Does she come back in, or is she just gone?
He's gone. Yep.
Except in the movies.
Except in the movies.
Yeah.
We also notice, from all the movies, no love interests in this story. There's a lot of great love interests in all the movies.
Yeah.
Not here.
So where was Midian?
What's that?
Where was Midian? Was it in Egypt or?
Midian would be down in the Sinai Peninsula.
Oh, no, that's not Egypt.
It would be east of Egypt. Yes.
Like east of Eden?
Yes, exactly. Good. Any other questions? All right. All right, we got a good start. We hit some big stuff. Let me pray for us. God, we thank you for this time for us to read and to study and to learn and to grow. God, help us see in this story that even in the darkest, hardest times, in times of oppression, in times of trouble and feeling alone, you hear, you remember, and you work to deliver your people. God, I pray that we hear, each and every one of us, your call on us, that we hear your call to be your voice. And just as we see the burning bush, let us see how it points forward to the day of Pentecost, where you empower each and every one of us to go out and to speak your word, to speak to power, to call us to you. God, I pray that you bless this day, keep us well and safe. Let us do your work. We pray this all in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.
Great stuff.
All right. everyone.
Thanks, Dean.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Nancy, did you get,
Yeah.
did you get my text about the new diaper client?
I did. I'm gonna go in today and I'll see it, but thank you. Yeah, I think we're gonna cancel, Natalie.
Yeah.
I've been trying to see what the time frame is on the snow, and I
1
think they've
a.m.
moved it back 1 a.m., but I think it's still gonna be on the ground at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we're gonna have a lot of snow for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll change the message.
yeah, the kids need snow.
I'll
What's that?
change the Gates covered message, Nancy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Judy, are you getting the ice?
Okay, that's great.
No,
Good.
This is gonna be.
Yeah, but keep your eyes out for burning bushes.
What's
Yeah.
that?
Right.
Yeah, stay warm, everybody.
All right.
Goodbye.
Next week.
Bye.
Okay.